Kindness always finds its way, I whispered to myself as the morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of Carter's diner, painting the linoleum floor with streaks of gold. I had been running behind schedule, balancing trays of scrambled eggs and coffee cups, the clatter of dishes blending with the low hum of the jukebox in the corner. My apron was smudged with syrup, and my hair had escaped its loose bun, strands sticking to the back of my neck from the heat of the small kitchen. Outside, the street was already bustling. Delivery trucks honked, cyclists weaved through traffic, and pedestrians shuffled by with the weight of the week pressing down on them. That's when I noticed him, Liam Johnson, sitting at the corner booth, shoulders slumped, eyes wide and pleading. His small hands clutched a brown paper bag that barely contained the scraps of what had once been a hot meal. My heart clenched as I watched him glance around, obviously trying to disappear from anyone who might notice his hunger. Without thinking, I scooped a plate of pancakes and scrambled eggs, the ones we had saved for the lunch rush, and quietly placed it in front of him. "Here," I said softly, forcing a smile that felt more like a lifeline than a greeting. He looked up, eyes shimmering, a hesitant smile flickering before it was swallowed by doubt. I knelt beside him, adjusting the plate, careful not to draw attention from the other patrons. The smell of butter and warm syrup filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of coffee and toasted bread, and for a moment, the diner felt like a sanctuary. As Liam dug in, I straightened up and felt a presence behind me, a man standing near the entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, in a crisp charcoal suit that made him look almost statuesque against the muted colors of the diner. His dark hair was swept back neatly, but it was the sharp, ice-blue eyes that cut through the morning haze and landed directly on me. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched with a measured intensity that made my pulse spike and my stomach tighten. I kept my hands busy, pouring coffee, arranging utensils, but I could feel his gaze like a weight pressing against my spine. The jukebox's soft rock track seemed to fade, the chatter of the other patrons blending into background static, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the distant clatter of dishes. I caught Liam looking up at me, relief and hunger battling in his expression, and a small warmth bloomed in my chest, a quiet pride in the simple act of helping. That's when the man shifted slightly, stepping closer, the polished leather of his shoes whispering across the linoleum. He didn't speak, but his presence was undeniable, commanding the space around him, drawing attention without any effort at all. My fingers trembled slightly as I wiped a counter, heart racing, but I held my ground, refusing to let my fear show to the child in front of me. Minutes stretched, each tick of the wall clock echoing louder than the last, and I realized the entire morning had slowed, narrowed to this one moment where kindness and observation collided. Then, without a word, he turned, moving toward the register with the same precise, calculated motion that had drawn my eyes to him in the first place. He paid in cash, quietly, leaving a tip that was more than generous, then stepped out into the sunlight, the bell above the door chiming softly behind him. I exhaled, the tension in my shoulders loosening slightly, but the image of those piercing eyes lingered, and a small, insistent whisper echoed in my mind. Maybe, just maybe, doing the right thing doesn't go unnoticed. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of coffee refills, lunch orders, and the constant ringing of the old service bell above the kitchen window, but I could not stop thinking about the man in the charcoal suit. Every time the front door opened, my eyes lifted automatically, expecting to see those ice-blue eyes again. They never appeared. By 4 o'clock, the afternoon sunlight had softened into amber streaks across the booths, and Liam was still sitting in the corner, carefully finishing the last bites of food as if he was afraid the meal might disappear if he ate too quickly. I carried over a glass of orange juice and slid it in front of him. His eyes widened. "For me?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "For you." The smile that spread across his face was worth more than every tip I had earned that week. A few minutes later, the front door opened again, and a woman rushed inside, breathless and worried. Her dark coat hung loosely from her shoulders, and strands of blonde hair clung to her cheeks from the wind outside. The moment Liam saw her, he jumped from the booth. "Mom!" Relief flooded her face as she wrapped her arms around him. I looked away, suddenly feeling like I was witnessing something private. After a moment, she approached me. Her eyes looked tired, the kind of tired that came from carrying too many responsibilities for too long. "Thank you," she said softly. "He told me what you did." I shook my head. "It was nothing." She smiled sadly. No. It was everything. Before I could answer, she placed a folded $20 bill on the counter. I pushed it back immediately. Please. Keep it. Her eyes shimmered slightly, and for a second I thought she might argue. Instead, she nodded and guided Liam toward the door. Just before leaving, the boy turned back and waved enthusiastically. I waved back, watching them disappear into the fading afternoon light. The diner felt strangely quiet afterward. Even the jukebox seemed softer. I spent the next hour wiping tables and stacking menus while my manager, Frank Miller, paced near the register calculating numbers under his breath. Frank had owned Carter's Diner for almost 20 years, and lately he looked older every day. The deep lines around his eyes seemed sharper. The gray in his beard seemed heavier. Everything okay? I asked. He forced a smile. Just business. But his voice carried a weight that told a different story. Around closing time, two men entered wearing dark suits. They were not customers. That much was obvious immediately. Their clothes were too perfect, their posture too disciplined. They moved through the diner with quiet confidence, scanning the room before approaching Frank. I tried not to stare, but it was impossible not to notice the sudden tension that settled over the building. Frank disappeared into his office with them for nearly 30 minutes. When he finally emerged, his face had gone pale. The men left, without ordering anything. The bell above the door chimed softly behind them. Frank stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the entrance. Frank? I asked carefully. He blinked and looked at me as though he had forgotten I was there. Go home, Emily, he said. Get some rest. Something about his tone sent a chill through me. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside into the cool evening air. Across the street, parked beneath a street lamp, sat a black luxury sedan. The same man from that morning stood beside it, one hand in his pocket, watching the diner through the glowing front windows. For a brief second our eyes met across the distance. Then he opened the rear door, stepped inside, and the car pulled away into the night, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk with questions I could not answer. The next morning the diner felt different, as though the events of yesterday had left an invisible imprint on the air. Sunlight streamed through the windows in golden shafts, catching motes of dust that floated lazily above the tables. I arrived early, apron pressed neatly against my waist, and began arranging the chairs and wiping down counters, each swipe of the cloth methodical but my mind elsewhere. The front door opened and the familiar chime rang, but instead of customers, it was Alexander Kane stepping inside. His presence filled the room immediately, a quiet intensity that made even the humming refrigerator seem distant. He nodded at me, not a word, and moved to a booth near the corner, sitting down with a precision that suggested purpose, eyes scanning the room while maintaining an unmistakable focus on me. I swallowed, my hands gripping the cloth tighter, forcing my movements to seem casual, though my pulse had quickened. Around us, the morning patrons went about their breakfast, oblivious to the weight of the silent interaction unfolding. I took a deep breath and continued cleaning, my ears attuned to the soft scrape of his shoes against the floor, and the subtle click of the espresso machine in the background. He raised a hand briefly, and I understood that he wanted the daily specials, a request made without words but carried in the exact placement of his fingers. I recited the menu aloud, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest, and he listened with quiet attention, eyes lifting only occasionally to watch me, noting the way I moved, the careful attention to every detail, the small kindnesses extended to each customer. The door opened again and Liam Johnson appeared, clutching a small backpack and looking around nervously before spotting me. Relief washed over him when our eyes met. I motioned him to a booth and placed a warm muffin and a glass of milk in front of him. He smiled shyly and dug in, the crumbs falling onto the table as he savored each bite. Alexander's gaze did not waver, noting the interaction with a subtle tilt of his head. After a few minutes, he stood and walked toward the counter, handing over an envelope without a word. I opened it discreetly when he stepped back to his booth, discovering a generous donation for the diner, enough to cover several weeks of expenses and repair a small leak in the roof that had been driving me crazy for months. My heart raced, realizing that he had been observing not just the child but the care I took in everything, from preparing meals to cleaning up, each gesture recorded in that silent, calculating mind. The morning rush came and went, the sizzle of the griddle, the clatter of plates, and the murmurs of conversation filling the diner with life. Yet every time I glanced at Alexander, his presence felt like a protective shadow, and the envelope in my hand felt heavier than money. It carried a silent acknowledgment that small acts of kindness could ripple farther than I had imagined. As he finally rose to leave, he gave a brief nod toward Liam, who waved enthusiastically, and me, who could only manage a quiet smile. I watched him step out into the sunlit street, the bell chiming softly behind him, leaving a strange calm in the air, a sense that the diner had shifted subtly, that our small corner of the city had become a place where goodness did not go unnoticed, and that from this day forward everything could be different, though I did not yet know how. The following day arrived wrapped in gray clouds and the faint scent of rain. Drifting through the city streets. I unlocked the diner just before 6 in the morning, the familiar bell above the door greeting me with its cheerful chime as I stepped inside. The overhead lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the worn booths, the polished counter, and the coffee machine that seemed to work harder than anyone else in the building. For a few peaceful minutes, it was just me and the quiet hum of the refrigerators. Then Frank arrived. The moment he walked through the door, I knew something had changed. His shoulders seemed lighter. The deep worry that had been etched into his face for months had softened. He even smiled. A real smile. "Good morning, Emily," he said. "You look surprised." I laughed softly. "You look different." He rubbed the back of his neck. Maybe I finally slept. I wanted to ask what had happened after those men in suits visited his office, but something told me not to push. Throughout the morning, customers came and went. The smell of fresh bacon and coffee filled the air. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Around 10 o'clock, a delivery truck stopped outside. That alone was not unusual. What was unusual was the number of workers unloading supplies. New coffee beans, fresh produce, upgraded kitchen equipment, even replacement chairs for the dining area. Frank stared through the window in disbelief. "Did you order all this?" I asked. He slowly shook his head. The workers carried everything inside with professional efficiency. One of them handed Frank a clipboard and a sealed envelope. Frank opened it carefully. His eyes widened. Then he read the paper again. And again. "Frank?" I asked. He looked up at me, speechless for several seconds. "I do not understand." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" He handed me the document. The letter was brief, professional, precise. It explained that Carter's Diner had officially been purchased by a private investment group effective immediately. Existing employees would keep their positions. Salaries would increase. Benefits would be expanded. Renovations would begin soon. I read the words twice before they fully registered. "Someone bought the diner?" Frank nodded slowly. "Apparently." The room felt strangely still. Even the sound of rain seemed distant. I looked around at the familiar walls that had become a second home over the past 3 years. The old jukebox. The cracked menu board. The booths where regular customers sat every morning. Everything suddenly felt uncertain. "Who bought it?" I asked. Frank pointed toward the final page. There was only one name listed. Alexander Kane. My heart skipped. The paper felt heavier in my hands. Instantly, I remembered the man in the charcoal suit. The quiet observations. The envelope. The way he seemed to notice everything without speaking. Across the room, the front door opened. The bell chimed softly. As if summoned by the thought itself, Alexander stepped inside. Rain dotted the shoulders of his dark coat. His expression remained calm, unreadable. Yet somehow the entire atmosphere shifted the moment he entered. Conversations lowered. Heads turned. Not because he demanded attention, because he naturally commanded it. He approached the counter with measured steps. Frank straightened immediately. "Mr. Kane." Alexander offered a small nod. "Frank." Then those ice blue eyes moved toward me. For a second, neither of us spoke. The rain continued tapping against the windows. The coffee machine hissed softly in the background. Finally, I found my voice. "You bought the diner." It was not really a question. His gaze never left mine. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer somehow made it more shocking. I stared at him. Why? For the first time since I had met him, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite amusement. Something warmer. Something genuine. His eyes drifted briefly toward an empty booth near the window where Liam had sat days earlier. Then he looked back at me. Because some places are worth protecting. The words settled into the silence between us. Simple. Direct. Yet somehow they felt far bigger than the diner itself. And in that moment, standing beneath the warm glow of the overhead lights while rain painted silver lines across the glass, I realized this story had never been about a restaurant. For the rest of the day, Alexander's words stayed with me. Like an echo I could not silence. Because some places are worth protecting. The sentence sounded simple, but the longer I thought about it, the more complicated it became. By lunchtime, workers had already begun measuring sections of the diner, discussing improvements in low professional voices while customers watched curiously from their booths. New menu boards were being designed. Equipment upgrades were scheduled. Even the faded paint near the entrance would soon be replaced. It felt unreal. Just a week earlier, Frank had been staring at unpaid invoices and worrying about whether the diner would survive another month. Now everything was changing faster than any of us could process. Around 2 in the afternoon, the lunch crowd finally thinned. I was carrying a fresh pot of coffee toward a table when the front door opened and Liam rushed inside with the same oversized backpack bouncing against his shoulders. His face lit up the moment he saw me. "Miss Emily," he called. Several customers smiled at the sound of his excitement. I laughed and waved him over. "Hey, Liam." A moment later, his mother entered behind him. Today she looked different. Still tired but lighter somehow. The worry lines around her eyes seemed softer. "I hope we are not interrupting," she said. "Not at all." Liam immediately climbed into his favorite booth near the window. His mother glanced around the diner in surprise. "Everything looks different." I nodded. "You could say that." Before I could explain further, the door opened once more. The room seemed to quiet automatically. Alexander stepped inside. Unlike previous visits, he was not alone. 2 men in suits remained near the entrance while he walked toward the center of the diner. Liam spotted him immediately. To my surprise, the boy jumped from the booth and ran directly toward him. "Mr. Kane." Alexander stopped mid-step. For the first time since meeting him, I witnessed something unexpected. The hard edges of his expression softened. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal a glimpse of the man beneath the reputation. "Liam." The boy grinned proudly. "Mom says we found a better apartment." Alexander nodded once. "That is good news." Blinked. My eyes shifted toward Liam's mother. Her expression carried quiet gratitude. Suddenly pieces began connecting inside my mind. The apartment. The relief on her face. The timing. Alexander noticed my realization immediately. Those sharp blue eyes met mine across the room. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. The answer was written clearly enough. He had helped them. Not for recognition. Not for attention. Simply because he could. Liam continued talking excitedly about his new room and a nearby park while Alexander listened with patient attention. Watching them together felt strangely surreal. This powerful businessman who could buy an entire diner without hesitation was standing completely still, while a little boy described playground equipment in remarkable detail. Eventually Liam returned to his booth. Alexander approached the counter where I stood. The smell of fresh coffee drifted between us. "You helped them," I said quietly. His gaze remained calm. "I provided an opportunity." "Because of one meal?" For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked toward Liam sitting by the window. "No." His voice was low and steady. "Because of the person who chose to give it." My breath caught. Before I could find a response, he turned toward the door. The rain outside had finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, filling the diner with warm gold light. And for the first time, I began to understand that every act of kindness creates a story long before anyone realizes it has begun. Evening approached, and the diner was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun filtering through the large front windows. The golden light stretched across the floor, illuminating dust particles that danced lazily in the air. I moved through the kitchen and dining area, finishing prep work for the dinner crowd, my movements automatic yet precise, each plate and utensil placed with care. The quiet murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of silverware created a soothing rhythm. I glanced toward the corner booth, where a small stack of children's books had been left by Liam earlier in the day. I picked one up and ran my fingers across the worn cover, smiling softly at the thought of him reading while waiting for his mother. Just as I set the book down, the bell above the door chimed, and Alexander Kane stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention without a word. The subtle scent of leather and fresh cologne drifted faintly, blending with the aroma of coffee and baked bread. He moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made the space around him seem smaller and more focused. I wiped my hands on a towel, heart beating slightly faster, knowing that his gaze would find me, and it did. Those ice-blue eyes locked with mine, calm yet intensely observant. He nodded slightly, acknowledging my presence without a word, then walked to a booth near the back. I watched as he carefully scanned the diner, his attention catching the details I had grown accustomed to ignoring: the way the sunlight struck the counter, the subtle alignment of chairs, the small imperfections in the floor. There was purpose in his observation, but no judgment, only awareness. Frank emerged from the office slightly hesitant, then approached Alexander with a polite smile and a few murmured words. I could see the respect in his posture, the subtle tilt of his head, and then he stepped back, leaving Alexander alone. For several minutes, he sat quietly, sipping coffee and observing the ebb and flow of the diner. Occasionally his gaze would drift toward the corner booth where Liam's books rested, a faint hint of amusement or satisfaction flickering across his features. I returned to wiping down tables, careful to keep my movements calm, yet I could not help noticing the way he seemed to notice everything, from the slight tremor in my hand as I lifted a coffee cup to the way a napkin fluttered in the breeze near the open window. Time seemed to bend slightly around him, slowing and sharpening, each detail magnified in my perception. As the dinner crowd began to trickle in, a few familiar faces and a handful of new ones, Alexander rose from his seat and approached the counter. His presence brought an unspoken order to the room, an assurance that all was in its proper place. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice steady and even, "the diner has potential." I blinked, caught off guard by the calm assertion. "Potential?" I repeated. "Yes," he continued, "to be a place where people feel safe, welcomed and cared for. You have created that already." My chest tightened with a mix of surprise and gratitude, the words landing like a gentle affirmation. I nodded, unsure of what to say, but feeling the weight of recognition, not for the work alone, but for the intentions behind it. Alexander paused, eyes sweeping the room one last time before moving toward the door, then stopped. His gaze met mine again, and for a heartbeat, there was an unspoken understanding that simple acts of kindness performed without expectation could change more than a single day. They could create ripples that altered lives in ways unseen. And with that, he stepped outside, leaving the diner filled with warm light, the lingering scent of coffee, and a sense of calm determination that seemed to settle over everything and everyone within its walls. The following morning arrived crisp and clear, the sunlight streaming through the large diner windows casting sharp lines across the polished floors. I arrived early, the scent of freshly baked bread and brewed coffee filling the air as I unlocked the door and began preparing for the day ahead. The city outside hummed with activity. Delivery trucks rumbled down the street, cyclists weaved through traffic, and pedestrians hurried past with umbrellas tucked under arms despite the clear sky. I moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, placing plates on the warming rack, arranging condiments, and double-checking the coffee machine. Each motion was deliberate, yet my mind kept drifting to the events of the past week. Alexander Kane had transformed the diner into a place of safety and opportunity, yet his presence lingered in every corner, a quiet reminder of the ripple effect of small acts. Around 9 o'clock, the morning rush began, and familiar customers trickled in. Orders were called, coffee brewed, and the gentle murmur of conversation filled the space. Liam Johnson and his mother arrived shortly after, their smiles brighter than the sunlight pouring through the windows. I guided them to their favorite booth, placing a glass of milk and a plate of pancakes in front of Liam. He looked up at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "Thank you, Miss Emily." I nodded with a soft smile, returning to the counter, my thoughts briefly straying to the man who had set all of this into motion. Midway through the breakfast hour, the front door chimed, and Alexander stepped inside. This time there was no formal announcement, no envelope quietly placed on the counter. He walked directly to the kitchen, his posture composed, eyes scanning the room with the same measured attention I had come to recognize. I felt my pulse quicken but maintained my rhythm, moving between tables, refilling coffee, and setting plates with precision. He observed quietly, noting every detail, from the way I arranged napkins to the careful attention I gave each customer. Eventually, he approached the counter where I stood, placing a hand on its polished edge. His eyes met mine, the ice blue gaze steady yet carrying a subtle warmth. "Emily," he said, voice calm, "you have created a place where kindness matters." I blinked, unsure how to respond. The words seemed simple, but the weight behind them was immense. He gestured toward the corner booth where Liam sat, his mother watching with gentle pride. "Because of small choices, entire lives change," Alexander continued. I swallowed, realizing that he spoke not only of the diner but of every decision, every meal served, every act of care extended without expectation. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, filling the space with golden light that reflected off the polished surfaces, bouncing warmth into every corner. Alexander finally moved toward the door, pausing to glance back at the diner, at me, at the life unfolding within these walls. For a heartbeat, his gaze held a quiet promise, an understanding that the world was larger than this moment, yet somehow connected to it. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped outside, leaving behind a sense of calm and the unspoken knowledge that even the smallest gestures of generosity could resonate far beyond the confines of a single day or a single diner. The evening crowd had begun to settle into a calm rhythm, the low hum of conversation blending with the gentle hiss of the coffee machine, and the soft clatter of plates being cleared from tables. The sunlight had faded to a warm amber glow, spilling across the counters and casting long, soft shadows over the booths. I moved from table to table, refilling coffee and arranging silverware with deliberate care, each motion precise yet infused with an awareness of the space around me. Liam and his mother had left earlier, the boy waving one last time as they stepped out into the cooling evening air, leaving behind the faint scent of his backpack and a lingering smile in my memory. The diner felt quieter but not empty. Patrons settled into corners with newspapers and laptops, their soft chatter forming a gentle background to my movements. I paused by the counter, glancing at the envelope Alexander Kane had left behind during his last visit. The weight of it in my hands had seemed heavy then, but now it felt lighter, imbued with a sense of trust and expectation. I had spent the day watching how small gestures could influence everything, noticing the subtle improvements in the diner, the more attentive movements of the staff, and the way customers seemed to linger just a little longer, smiling more readily, speaking more softly, enjoying the sense of warmth the place radiated. The front door chimed again, and I looked up instinctively, expecting another familiar face. Alexander stepped inside, his presence immediately noticeable, though he moved without urgency, as if the air itself had bent slightly to accommodate him. His coat was darker than the shadows stretching across the floor, and the faint scent of leather and cologne reached me before his words did. He did not speak immediately, allowing the room to settle around him, letting each patron return to their own conversations, oblivious to the quiet authority he radiated. I carried a tray of freshly brewed coffee toward a table, careful to keep my movements smooth and natural, though I felt his gaze like a subtle weight across my back. He watched, yet not in a way that intruded, more like a quiet acknowledgment that everything I did mattered. As I approached the table, he took a step forward, moving toward the counter, his footsteps soft against the floor. "Emily," he said, voice calm, measured and low, "you have built more than a diner." I blinked, startled by the clarity of the statement. "More than a diner?" I repeated softly. He nodded, ice blue eyes steady. "A place where lives are touched, where care and attention create change without anyone noticing." My hands trembled slightly as I set down the last cup, the meaning of his words sinking in. He glanced toward the window where the golden light pooled on the floor, the quiet corners of the diner basking in the glow of late afternoon. "Kindness has consequences beyond sight," he continued. "Every small choice you make shapes the world around you in ways you may not perceive." I swallowed, feeling the weight of his observation, realizing that every plate served, every smile returned, every detail attended to, resonated far beyond the moment itself. Outside, the sky deepened into shades of purple and blue, the city lights flickering on one by one. Alexander finally stepped back toward the door, pausing to glance at the entire diner, then at me. For a brief heartbeat, our eyes met, and in that silent exchange, I understood the depth of his presence and the quiet impact of what I had chosen to do. The bell chimed softly behind him as he stepped out, leaving the diner bathed in a mixture of fading sunlight and artificial light, carrying with it the unspoken promise that small acts of care could ripple outward, changing everything in ways unseen but profoundly felt. The weeks that followed seemed to pass in the space between heartbeats. The diner continued to change, but somehow it never lost the warmth that had made it special in the first place. Fresh paint brightened the walls. New lighting cast a welcoming glow across the dining room. The worn booths were restored instead of replaced, preserving the memories tucked into every corner. Customers noticed the improvements immediately, yet what they talked about most was not the renovation. It was the feeling. Families stayed longer. Strangers started conversations. Regulars brought friends. Somehow the diner had become more than a place to eat. It had become part of the neighborhood's heartbeat. One cool Saturday morning, sunlight poured through the windows as I carried a tray of coffee toward a group of customers near the entrance. The smell of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen. Laughter filled the room. For a moment, I stopped and simply looked around. Frank was smiling behind the register. The staff moved confidently through the breakfast rush. Liam sat in his usual booth near the window, working on a school project while his mother enjoyed a cup of coffee beside him. They looked happy, safe, settled. The sight warmed something deep inside me. Then the front door opened. The familiar bell chimed softly. Alexander Kane stepped inside. Conversations continued. Dishes clinked. The city moved beyond the glass. Yet somehow I noticed him immediately, just as I always did. He wore a dark coat against the autumn chill, and his expression carried the same calm confidence I had come to recognize. But today felt different. There was no business meeting waiting. No workers measuring walls. No documents to sign. He simply walked through the diner and stopped beside the counter. "Busy morning," he observed. I smiled. "The busiest we have ever had." His gaze swept across the room. Liam spotted him and waved enthusiastically. Alexander returned the gesture with a small nod. A few months ago, I would never have imagined seeing that. The powerful man who could change lives with a single decision now seemed perfectly content standing inside a neighborhood diner, watching a little boy finish his homework. "You were right," I said quietly. His eyes shifted toward me. "About what?" I looked around the room. At the customers. At Frank. At Liam and his mother. At the life unfolding around us. This place was worth protecting. For a moment, silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that comes when words are no longer necessary. Then Alexander smiled. It was small, brief, real. "No," he said softly. "The people were." My chest tightened unexpectedly. Outside, golden leaves drifted along the sidewalk. Inside, the morning sunlight filled every corner of the diner with warmth. I thought back to that first day. One hungry child. One simple meal. One decision made without expecting anything in return. At the time, it had felt insignificant. Just another moment in another ordinary shift. Yet standing here now, surrounded by lives that had changed, I finally understood something important. Kindness is rarely small. We only call it small because we cannot immediately see where it travels. Sometimes it reaches one person. Sometimes it reaches many. Sometimes it circles back in ways we never imagined. Alexander glanced around the diner one final time before turning toward the door. The bell chimed softly as sunlight spilled through the opening behind him. Just before stepping outside, he paused and looked back. Our eyes met across the room. There was gratitude there, respect, and something deeper that neither of us needed to name. Then he stepped into the sunlight and disappeared into the moving city beyond the glass. I watched the door close gently behind him and smiled to myself. Because in a world that often felt too busy to notice, one simple act of kindness had changed everything.